My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius." The line echoes through centuries, but behind it lies a truth far colder than cinema dares to tell. The real man wasn't a gladiator. He was a Roman general who held back the collapse of the West when gods turned silent and empires began to rot. His victories were not carved in marble arenas, but in frozen forests and dying camps. His weapon was not vengeance. It was endurance. Before Hollywood's myth, there was history's silence, and from that silence rose Marcus Nonius Macrinus, the true Maximus. In the year 166 CE, the Roman Empire stretched from the misty marshes of Britannia to the parched deserts of Mesopotamia. On maps, it looked eternal, a marble colossus spanning the world. In truth, it was a sick giant with fevered veins. The Antonine Plague, born in the east and carried by victorious legions returning from Parthia, began its quiet devastation. The same soldiers who once marched beneath triumphal arches now carried death inside their lungs. Towns emptied, temples filled with prayers unanswered. At its height, the plague killed perhaps 1 in every 10 Romans. Some scholars claim even more. Cities that had thrived under the glow of civilization were reduced to pyres and silence. Grain shipments faltered, slaves vanished, farmers abandoned their fields. Rome's economy, built on endless expansion and steady tribute, began to creak under the weight of its own grandeur. In the Senate, the marble pillars could not hide the fear. Armies on the frontiers begged for reinforcements that would never come. Yet, to the outside world, the empire still wore its golden mask. Roads were swept, coins minted, statues polished. The illusion of immortality continued, because illusions are the last luxury of the powerful. But beyond the northern borders, the storm was gathering. Across the Danube, the tribes that Rome had once dismissed as scattered barbarians were uniting. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians, long-time rivals, saw opportunity in Rome's sickness. Under a fierce leader named Balamar, they formed something rare, a confederation bound not by blood, but by desperation and hunger. The winter of 167 was brutal. The Danube froze solid, turning the river, once Rome's shield, into a bridge. The tribes crossed in silence, their wagons creaking under the moonlight, their horses steaming in the frost. The Roman forts that guarded the frontier, undermanned and starving, fell within days. Smoke rose like funeral incense over the snow. For the first time in centuries, enemy banners pierced Italy itself. Cities like Opitergium and Aquileia saw war at their gates. Panic rippled through Rome, not just fear of invasion but of revelation, that the empire, thought to be unbreakable, could bleed like any mortal thing. And in the midst of this chaos stood Emperor Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, stoic, and reluctant warlord. The man who wrote Meditations on Virtue now faced the end of the world he sought to understand. He could not negotiate with plague or reason with hunger. His empire demanded swords, not scrolls. Thus began the Marcomannic Wars, a campaign that would define the final decades of Rome's unity. And among the men Marcus called to his side was one who would shape its fate more than any poet or general, a man history would later forget, but whose choices saved a civilization from dying a century early. His name was Marcus Nonius Macrinus. Forget the arena. Forget the sand, the crowd, the emperor's thumb. The real Maximus never fought for applause. He fought for time, for order, for the fragile continuity of Rome itself. Marcus Nonius Macrinus was not a slave-turned-hero, but a senator-turned-soldier, a patrician from Brixia, northern Italy. Born into privilege, he could have chosen the quiet life of marble halls and rhetoric. Instead, he chose the frontier, where philosophy froze and ideals starved. Macrinus's career was a map of duty. He served as quaestor, then praetor, and eventually consul, one of the highest offices in the empire. He was trusted by Marcus Aurelius himself, not merely for loyalty, but for understanding. The emperor, steeped in Stoic thought, valued men who could govern themselves before commanding others. Macrinus was that man, cold, deliberate, impossible to bribe and impossible to terrify. In 168 CE, Marcus appointed him governor of Pannonia, a frontier province bleeding from the plague and surrounded by hostile tribes. To others, it was exile. To Macrinus, It was the operating table on which the empire's survival would be tested. The Roman legions stationed there were ghosts of their former selves, undermanned, underfed, and demoralized. Veterans coughed blood beside green recruits. The lines between soldier, beggar, and corpse blurred. Even the officers whispered that the empire was cursed. Macrinus arrived not with speeches but with orders. He restored discipline like a surgeon cutting away rot. Every deserter was hunted down, every supply line redrawn, every camp restructured. He was not cruel, he was clinical. Bread before pride, clean water before glory. Rome, he believed, could not fight external chaos if it rotted from within. And yet, beneath his austere command, there was something almost modern, a belief that morale was the truest weapon. He reorganized rations, ensured boots were repaired, and instituted rotating patrols to keep men active and sane. He made sure every soldier, from the centurion to the cook, knew why they were there. Not to serve marble gods or distant senators, but to protect their own farms, their own children, their own Rome. Macrinus understood something most generals never did, that war was not about killing the enemy, it was about convincing your men that dying had the meaning. In a world devoured by plague, where faith cracked and gods seemed deaf, he gave them something new to believe in: endurance. By the time Marcus Aurelius visited the front in 170 CE, Pannonia had changed. The legions stood straighter. Their eyes no longer looked toward Rome, but outward, toward the frostbitten horizon. Marcus saw in Macrinus not just efficiency, but a mirror of his own stoic resolve. He promoted him to Comes Augustorum, the emperor's companion in arms. It was a quiet appointment without fanfare or laurel, but in that decision lay the survival of the Western world, because soon the tribes would surge again, and this time Rome's survival wouldn't depend on philosophy or faith, but on one man's capacity to turn exhaustion into order and despair into discipline: Marcus Nonius Macrinus, the general who inspired the legend of Maximus, not through spectacle, but through the relentless refusal to collapse when the empire itself was breaking. When Marcus Aurelius summoned his war council in Carnuntum, the air was thick with desperation and incense. Around the wooden table, the empire's finest minds debated how to save the frontier. Some argued for withdrawal, abandon the provinces north of the Alps and fortify Italy itself. Others begged for a grand decisive battle, a spectacle to remind the world that Rome still ruled by thunder. Marcus Nonius Macrinus said little. He listened, watched, and then he spoke with the calm precision of a surgeon diagnosing a dying patient. "We don't win this war by killing their warriors," he said. "We win it by killing their will." To the other generals it sounded heartless. To Marcus Aurelius it sounded like truth. Macrinus understood what the philosopher-emperor had written in his own meditations. The obstacle is the way. The empire could no longer rely on heroic charges or overwhelming numbers. Both were gone. What remained was endurance, logistics, and the patient cruelty of strategy. He rejected the idea of a single decisive battle. A victory might raise morale, yes, but it would drain men, horses, and supplies, and the tribes could replace their losses faster than Rome could. Instead, he proposed a war of exhaustion. The enemy would be forced to bleed not in one glorious day, but across endless nights. Ambushes, scorched villages, poisoned wells, starvation. A battle fought not with trumpets, but with silence and frost. Marcus granted him Imperium Maius, supreme authority over the Danubian front. Macrinus's first act was not to march, but to plan. He redrew the maps. He studied rivers, valleys, and supply routes as if they were veins in a living organism. He turned geography into a weapon. He saw mountains not as obstacles but as traps, forests not as dangers but as hiding places for ghosts. His orders stunned many commanders. No pursuit beyond the line, he declared after minor victories. No trophies, no boasting. Every step must serve the whole. He even forbade erecting statues for fallen officers, arguing that marble monuments wasted manpower and morale. The living need honour, not the dead, he said coldly. Behind his severity lay something profound, a philosophy of control. Macrinus believed that war was not about fire, but about temperature. Too cold, and soldiers lose their spirit. Too hot, and they burn themselves out. The art was to keep the army simmering, disciplined, angry, but never reckless. Winter was coming. and unlike other generals who dreaded it, Macrinus welcomed it. The tribes had brought their families, their herds, their wagons. They needed food, warmth, and shelter. Rome could survive hunger with rations and structure. The tribes could not. "Let winter be our legion," he told his staff. He ordered small, mobile units to harass enemy foragers. Supply caravans disappeared into the snow. Every night the barbarians' fires grew fewer, their songs weaker. When frostbite set in, the survivors began to whisper of curses and Roman witchcraft. By the year's end, Macrinus had achieved what battles never could: paralysis. The tribes still stood on Roman soil, but they were starving, freezing, and afraid. The empire, though wounded, was breathing again, and the soldiers, once broken, once terrified, began to believe that their commander was not just clever, but invincible. Not because he promised glory, but because he promised survival. When Macrinus took command of the Danubian legions, they were more shadow than army. The plague had hollowed them out. Desertions were rising. Their weapons rusted in damp barracks. Many had not been paid in years. To them the empire was not worth dying for. He began where others never thought to look: the stomach. "You can't fight on empty bellies or rotten water," he told his officers. He reorganized the supply network, cutting out corrupt middlemen who pocketed grain and silver. Fresh bread, clean water, straw for bedding. These became his first victories. Soldiers who expected orders found kindness in structure, and structure in kindness. Then came discipline. Not the theatrical cruelty of decimation, but the quiet rigour of expectation. Patrols ran on time. Equipment inspections were sacred. Macrinus himself ate what his soldiers ate. He walked the camps at night without escort. His presence was both reassurance and warning. Their commander saw everything, and expected everything. He brought back Roman dignity through small rituals. Baths were rebuilt, banners redyed, drills reinstated. Not for beauty, but for unity. He understood the psychology of routine. Soldiers who polished shields together survived together. Cleanliness became faith. Order became prayer. But Macrinus went beyond logistics. He understood the battlefield of the mind. "Fear," he said, "isn't cured by courage. It's cured by reason." He made sure every man knew why they fought, not for the Senate, not for the emperor's marble face, but for their homes behind them. He gathered men in the cold evenings to read out reports of villages spared, farms protected, children still alive because they held the line. His reforms rippled beyond the camps. Local civilians, once terrified of Roman requisitions, began to cooperate. Farmers provided food willingly, knowing Macrinus paid fair and punished theft harshly. Trust, the rarest currency in war, began to circulate again. He also turned the plague's ruins into opportunity. The epidemic had left fields empty, workshops closed, slaves dead. Macrinus recruited survivors, craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, into the military infrastructure. His camps became self-sustaining fortresses. They baked their own bread, forged their own nails, even brewed their own medicine. Every tent was a heartbeat, every soldier a moving brick in the wall of Rome. The transformation was slow, almost invisible, but by spring the legions were unrecognizable. Visitors from Rome marveled at their discipline. One officer wrote that the Danubian camps smelled not of death, but of bread and iron. Macrinus had done something no battle could achieve. He rebuilt faith. Soldiers stopped counting their pay and started counting victories, however small. A bridge repaired, a patrol returned intact, an ambush foiled. They began to call themselves the Legion of Winter, proud of surviving what others fled. And through this quiet resurrection, Macrinus became something far greater than a general. He became the empire's immune system, identifying weakness, isolating it, and healing what was left. He wasn't leading men toward glory, he was leading them away from extinction. Rome would one day forget his name, but in those frozen months by the Danube, his soldiers remembered him not as a legend, but as the man who made them believe that even in the darkest winter, Rome could still wake up alive. Winter had passed, but peace had not. Along the frontier, outposts still flickered like candles in the dark, isolated, surrounded, fragile. One of them, Fort Asali, stood deep in enemy territory, a modest timber fort with 500 men, most of them half recovered from the plague. It guarded nothing of value, no gold, no supply road, no river crossing. Yet, when news came that 10,000 Marcomanni warriors were advancing toward it, the Roman high command argued it wasn't worth saving. "Let it fall," said one of the generals. "Better lose 500 men than risk 3,000 more in a suicide march." Macrinus said nothing for a moment. Then quietly he replied, "If Asali falls, it's not 500 men we lose. It's the faith of 50,000. He understood the invisible front and morale. Rome's armies didn't fight only for orders. They fought for the belief that Rome stood behind them. To abandon Asali would mean more than the loss of a fort. It would mean telling every soldier in the north that loyalty was a one-way street. And that, Macrinus knew, was how empires die. He ordered a relief force, 3,000 men, 2 elite cohorts and a detachment of Gallic cavalry, to move immediately. The distance, nearly 80 kilometres. The deadline, 36 hours. Snow still clung to the ground. Rivers were swollen with meltwater. He told his officers, "We march light. No wagons, no fires. Every hour counts." The soldiers obeyed, not because they believed it possible, but because they believed in him. For 36 hours they trudged through mud and sleet, sleeping only in 10-minute bursts, rationing bread to crumbs. Macrinus walked on foot beside them, his armour stripped down to bare essentials, his cloak soaked, his face expressionless. One centurion later wrote, "He looked not like a man, but like the mountain that moved with us." At dusk on the second day, scouts spotted smoke, Fort Asali. The garrison was still fighting, but barely. From their hilltop vantage, the Romans could see enemy fires encircling the fort, thousands of tents and siege engines scattered like dark stars against the snow. Macrinus gathered his officers. "They think we're too far. They think no one comes. So we arrive as ghosts." His plan was audacious. He would strike not at the walls of the fort, but at the confidence of the besiegers. The Gallic cavalry would charge the rear, slashing tents and supply lines. 2 cohorts would descend on the flanks with torches, setting the camp ablaze. Meanwhile, signal horns from the fort would announce salvation, though the defenders wouldn't know how few reinforcements had come. As the sun vanished, the Roman horns cried out from the hills, echoing through the valley like the voice of vengeance. The cavalry thundered down the slope, flames trailing from their lances. Panic erupted before steel even touched flesh. Wagons overturned, fires spread, and the Marcomanni, convinced a full Roman army had arrived, began to scatter. Inside the fort, the half-starved defenders saw the impossible. Roman standards through the smoke. They surged out, screaming, "Roma! Roma!" Their charge from within crushed the disoriented besiegers between hammer and anvil. By dawn, the battlefield was silent except for groans and crows. Macrinus walked through the ruins, blood steaming on the frost. He said nothing of heroism, only one order left his lips: bury the dead, theirs and ours, and clean the wells. Fort Asali lived, but more importantly, Rome's spirit lived. Across the frontier, soldiers whispered the story of the March of Ghosts, the miracle of Asali. Macrinus had not just saved a fort, he had inoculated an army against despair. The Battle of Asali would become a textbook in Roman psychological warfare, the art of killing fear with fear itself. Macrinus knew how fragile the human mind was in war. The Marcomanni believed in omens, in spirits, in signs from the sky. So he gave them one. Fire and thunder in the night, cavalry that appeared from the mist, horns echoing from every direction. It was not simply a tactic, it was theatre. To the tribes, it seemed divine. To the Romans, it felt supernatural. To Macrinus, it was mathematics. Confusion multiplies faster than courage. In the chaos of that night, the Gallic cavalry functioned like needles injecting panic into the enemy's bloodstream. They didn't charge to kill, they charged to shatter coordination. They targeted supply wagons, command tents, and signal drums. When an army's ears and stomach vanish, its heart follows. Meanwhile, the infantry advanced methodically, shields overlapping, pila ready, stepping over corpses with mechanical precision. There was no battle cry, no emotion, just rhythm, the sound of discipline against disorder. One legionary later recalled, "We moved as if a single mind, and that mind was not human." Inside Fort Asali, when the defenders heard the horns, they thought the empire itself had come for them. Men too weak to stand moments before picked up swords. They burst out of the gates and fell upon their besiegers like revenants. It was not strategy anymore, it was resurrection. By dawn, the valley was carpeted in bodies. Smoke drifted across the snow. The cavalry herded the remaining survivors into captivity. Macrinus stood at the edge of the field, watching without triumph. Victory, to him, was a diagnosis, not a celebration. He wrote to Marcus Aurelius that evening, "We won without glory, which is the truest kind." The emperor's reply was simple: "You have given Rome another winter." From that point on, the Danubian frontier no longer feared the tribes. The men spoke of their commander with awe, not as a hero, but as something colder, more elemental. They said his mind could bend weather, that the snow obeyed him, that even wolves followed his camp. Of course, Macrinus dismissed such myths, but he understood their power. Let the soldiers believe. Belief was cheaper than gold and more valuable than legions. After Assali, he turned his attention to what he called the Long Harvest. He ordered small raiding parties to track retreating enemy bands, not to annihilate them, but to keep them terrified. Roman horns would sound in the distance every few nights, reminding the enemy that the ghosts still walked. It was a war without battlefields, villages deserted overnight. The sound of Roman drums became a curse in barbarian songs. Mothers frightened children with his name, and yet, within Rome, the Senate remained unmoved. They wanted victories they could engrave on marble. They wanted parades, captives, spectacle. Macrinus gave them none of that. He gave them safety, which in politics is invisible. For the soldiers, however, it was different. They had seen what discipline could do. They had lived through the firestorm and come out stronger. They began carving Assali on their shields, their belts, their swords, not as pride but as memory, because what they witnessed there was not just war. It was transformation, of chaos into order, of fear into function, of men into a machine that could stare into the abyss and not blink. The field at Assali became sacred ground, not because gods descended there, but because men discovered how to save themselves when the world refused to. And for Macrinus, that night proved his philosophy once more. You don't win by killing faster. You win by making the other side believe it's already dead. Victory at Assali changed everything, and nothing. The frontier was safer, but not safe. Word of Balamar's humiliation spread like wildfire across the north. The Marcomanni chief, humiliated but unbroken, swore vengeance. He called upon every allied tribe, Quadi, Sarmatians, Iazyges, even far-off Gothic clans, to rise in one final storm. Not a raid this time, but a migration, an exodus armed to the teeth. By summer, they were moving, men, women, children, carts, herds, a tide of nearly 200,000 souls. To them this was destiny. Rome's gods had grown weak, its walls rotten. They would take the land the empire no longer deserved. When reports reached Carnuntum, panic shook the Roman staff. "We cannot face that many," said one officer. "We must fortify Aquileia. Pull back to Italy." Another demanded immediate counterattack. "Strike now before they unite." Macrinus listened in silence. Then, with the same surgical calm that had defined him, he said, "We will not strike. We will starve them." He had no intention of defending every inch of land. His war was one of subtraction, not addition. Abandon villages, evacuate civilians, burn the grain, break the bridges, let them think we run. His lieutenants hesitated. "You would give up Pannonia?" "I give up land," he replied, "to save men. Soil can be rebuilt, cohesion cannot." It was madness to Roman eyes, retreating before the enemy, leaving behind empty towns and poisoned wells. But to Macrinus, it was anatomy. Starve the infection, isolate it, let it consume itself. As the vast horde crossed into Roman territory, they found silence. No ambushes, no defenders, only emptiness. Fields burned, villages stripped of food, wells tainted with lime. The Romans had vanished into the forests, leaving behind a ghost country. At first, Balamar laughed. "They flee like slaves," he roared. But the laughter faded within weeks. The tribes began to suffer. The wagons creaked slower. Horses collapsed from hunger. The further they advanced, the more the land turned to ash. Winter came early. Frost covered the plains and hunger became the true enemy. Fights broke out between clans. The Sarmatians abandoned the march, turning back east. Disease followed the starving children. From the shadows, Macrinus's patrols appeared like wraiths, striking at night, vanishing by dawn. They didn't need to win battles. They needed to remind the enemy that they were never alone. Every Roman horn, every glint of metal in the fog shredded morale. He called it the Great Hunt. Rome had become the predator, the tribes the prey. Balamar's coalition, once unified by ambition, was now devoured by mistrust and hunger. The tribes began killing one another for food and direction. For Macrinus, it was not victory yet, it was digestion. The war ends when they collapse under their own weight, he wrote to Marcus Aurelius. Until then, we keep the stomach empty and the heart terrified. By spring, the Marcomannic Confederation was breaking apart. Whole bands surrendered in exchange for bread. Others wandered north, leaving trails of bones across the snow. The flight of ghosts that had once crossed the Danube now fled it. Rome had endured, not through glory, but through starvation, patience, and brutal logic. And when the survivors finally gathered for one last stand, they did it in desperation, not pride. Macrinus was ready. He had been building toward this moment for 2 years. The trap was set. In the spring of 172 CE, what remained of Balamar's grand army stumbled south toward Aquileia, the gateway to Italy itself. They were starving, ragged, furious. Balamar, driven half-mad by failure, believed Rome had finally retreated to defend its heart. "Strike once more," he told his followers, "and the empire will crumble." But Macrinus had been waiting. He had chosen his battlefield carefully, a natural valley near Aquileia, bordered by a river on one side and forested slopes on the other. There was only one entrance and no escape once inside. It was the perfect cage. His own troops, veterans hardened by years of cold campaigns, were hidden behind ridges and trenches. The ground had been prepared for weeks, pits camouflaged with branches, stakes sharpened and buried at angles, channels dug to redirect the river should they need to flood the plain. When his scouts reported the enemy's approach, Macrinus gave a simple order: hold position, let them enter. From the hills, Roman archers watched the endless column of barbarians pour into the valley like a river of flesh and fury. Wagons, oxen, women, warriors, thousands of them. Balamar rode at the centre, shouting that Rome's cowards had run at last. Only when the last wagon passed through the valley mouth did Macrinus raise his hand. "Close the door," trumpets blared. From the ridges, legions rose as one, trench fires ignited, smoke rolling down like a storm. The narrow entrance filled with falling earth and collapsed timbers. The trap was sprung. Balamar realized too late. His army was boxed in. Panic rippled like lightning. Then came the Roman catapults, hurling stones and burning pitch into the crowd. The first ranks fell into pits, skewered on stakes. The rear tried to flee, only to find the exit sealed. Macrinus waited until chaos peaked. Then he gave the signal for the legions to advance. Shields locked, scooter forming an iron wall, the Romans pressed forward. Pila flew, gladi flashed, the air filled with screams and smoke. It was not a battle. It was surgery on a giant corpse still twitching. For hours the slaughter continued. Balamar's warriors fought like animals, clawing at shields, throwing stones when swords broke. But discipline always wins against desperation. When the enemy line buckled, Macrinus unleashed the final movement of his symphony. 2 hidden Roman detachments, one in the forest, one beyond the river, crashed into the flanks. The horde imploded. Men trampled their own families. Oxen stampeded through wagons. Fire spread from spilled tar. Within minutes, the army was not an army. It was a mob, then a grave. At the centre, Balamar himself was found wounded, surrounded by his last guards. He fought to the end, but the Roman spears closed around him. When he fell, it was silent, not from honour, but exhaustion. Even death seemed tired. By dusk, the field near Aquileia was quiet except for the hiss of cooling embers. Macrinus stood among the wreckage, his armour black with soot. He didn't smile. He only whispered, "It's over." The next day, his soldiers buried the dead and cleaned the battlefield. Not as victors, but as caretakers of order restored. For the first time in years, Italy's northern horizon was free of smoke. Rome had survived the apocalypse. And though history would later call it the Marcomannic War, those who fought under Macrinus called it something else, the War of Silence, where Rome spoke not through speeches but through discipline, patience, and the terrible calm of survival. When news reached Marcus Aurelius, he wept, not from sorrow but from relief. "He has saved our world," the emperor said, and yet the man who had done it would vanish from public memory. No statues, no poems, no triumphal march through the city. Only the wind by the Danube whispering his name. Marcus Nonius Macrinus, the general who defeated extinction itself. History forgets quietly. It buries not only the defeated, but the saviours who refuse applause. Marcus Nonius Macrinus was one of those. He had saved the Danubian frontier, stabilised a dying army, and bought the empire another century of life. Yet when the wars ended, his name faded. No triumphal parade, no marble arch, no poet immortalised him. Rome celebrated emperors and martyrs, not surgeons who kept the body alive through pain. When he finally returned to Italy, the Senate greeted him politely and then moved on. The plague had returned, the treasury was empty, and politics once again devoured gratitude. Macrinus retired to his villa near Brescia, the same city where he was born, surrounded by olive trees and silence. He had no taste for ceremony. The man who had fought to preserve civilization now lived as if he had already outlived it. Marcus Aurelius visited him once, briefly. The philosopher-emperor, old and exhausted, thanked him in person. The story says they shared a simple meal, bread, olives, and watered wine, and spoke not of war but of endurance. "We both fought against decay," Marcus said softly. "And both lost," Macrinus replied. "Not yet," the emperor smiled. "You delayed the inevitable, and that is victory enough." After the emperor's death, chaos returned. His son Commodus inherited the throne, turning Rome's stoic twilight into grotesque spectacle. Gladiatorial games replaced strategy. Vanity replaced vision. The empire Macrinus had fought to save began to rot again, this time from within. It was in this decline that legends were born. Rome needed myths to hide its wounds. Centuries later, storytellers searching through dusty scrolls stumbled upon fragments. A general who fought under Marcus Aurelius, victorious against the Marcomanni, loyal, disciplined, unnamed in glory. They reimagined him, fused him with rebellion, vengeance, blood, and spectacle. And thus was born Maximus Decimus Meridius, the cinematic ghost of a man too disciplined for drama. The world cheered for the movie's hero, the slave who defied an emperor, who fought in the arena for justice, who died to avenge his family. But history's Macrinus had no family to avenge, no throne to challenge, no speech to move crowds. His tragedy was quieter, to win everything and be forgotten for it. In 2008, archaeologists unearthed his tomb near the shore of Lake Garda. His sarcophagus, carved from white marble, still bore traces of Latin inscriptions: consul, governor, companion of the Augusti. No mention of glory, only duty. Moss covered the stone. Birds nested above it. The man who saved the empire had returned to dust in silence. But if you stand there, between the olive trees and the lake wind, you can imagine the echoes. Boots on frozen ground, the horns of Asali, the whispers of men who followed him through hunger and plague. His monument was not marble. It was the simple continuation of Rome. Farmers planting, merchants trading, children laughing. All because one man believed survival was worth more than spectacle. That is his true legacy. The film gave us emotion. History gives us endurance. The movie showed a man who fought for vengeance. The truth shows a man who fought for function. Both stand for something we desperately crave, meaning in the face of collapse. Macrinus was not a hero of destiny. He was a doctor of civilization. When others reached for swords, he reached for structure. When others sought glory, he sought order. He proved that empires do not fall from enemy blades, but from the rot of neglect, and that sometimes the greatest victories are invisible. So when the crowd in the cinema rises to applaud Maximus, they are unknowingly applauding Macrinus, the forgotten general who turned endurance into art, who fought not for revenge, but for time itself. because in every age there comes a moment when the world seems to crumble and someone, unseen, uncelebrated, must decide that the fight is still worth continuing. That was Marcus Nonius Macrinus, the real Maximus. The man who saved Rome by refusing to make himself its hero.